things are for networking, for people's careers, and let's make sure we get those back going. The SQL community, like we were just talking about, is pretty unique, pretty powerful, pretty special for networking. It's not something that a lot of other platforms have. So, but that's on the local organizers. So great job, Brigitte and Jeremiah and everybody else for keeping this thing rolling.
Thank you. And then if you didn't see the notice, I did hit the record button, so you guys are all on the record now.
Yep. Great. So welcome. This presentation is how to become a contributor to Microsoft Docs. We're going to be talking about the ways to contribute to Docs, some tips and tricks and things like that. So today's agenda, I'm going to introduce DevRel. I'm going to cover some of the tips and tricks in Microsoft Docs that you might not be aware of if you use Microsoft Docs. And by the way, this isn't about SQL Server specifically. That's the team that I'm on. That's my expertise and my background. But this is actually about anything in Microsoft Docs, anything in Azure, any product that they use, because they all use the same platform for documentation. So, Brigitte, you're getting into app dev stuff. Yeah, that's all covered on this too. Most importantly, we're going to talk about how to contribute to Microsoft's open source Docs as code in GitHub. We're going to talk about what Docs as code means and what you need to know. First thing you need to know actually is that you need a github.com account to contribute to do any of the things that we're going to talk about today. So if you don't have a github.com account already, even a personal one, a work one will do fine too. You'll need that. Throughout this presentation, feel free to add any of your questions. We actually do have a chat right now. Sometimes the chat doesn't work for everybody. So if you'd like, there's not so many of us. You can come off of mute at any time. Feel free to ask a question. We can be pretty informal today. So let's keep going. So I'm on the SQL Docs team. There's about 8 of us. Internally and affectionately, we're known as Rogue One because our manager's manager is a big Star Wars geek. But when we're not violating multiple copyright laws with that nickname, we support tens of thousands of articles about SQL Server. Everything from obviously the SQL products to everything in Azure that is SQL, and there's various flavors of that. Azure Synapse Analytics, which you should be paying attention to if you're really into that Snowflake presentation, and all the tooling like Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, things like that. But we're just one content team, the SQL Docs team. But today I'm talking about all of Microsoft Docs again for all technologies. So a bit of the mission statements about the hundreds of employees in content and learning at Microsoft. In short, we have 2 missions. 1, to enable students, job seekers, and workers online with comprehensive and trusted content experiences. And 2, to build an active community of contributors. Well, that second goal is why we're doing this presentation all over the world this year. We want to communicate specifically how you can be a part of that quality Microsoft Docs experience. How about how you can contribute to the community? This is something that would go toward a Microsoft MVP status or an application or an activity report, if that is something that you're interested in pursuing or renewing. This is definitely something that can be a part of that. I don't have any more information on that. I'm not on that side of things, but like most things, the MVP activity report is more about quality than quantity, if you know what I mean. But this is one of those things. Now, Microsoft Docs are not Wikipedia. It's not open to all edits, but we do have hundreds of thousands of articles, and we want to embrace the wisdom of you in the technical user community to maintain a very high level of that quality. And so opening the docs up to external contributors makes a lot of sense, and it's also part of how our team scales. So the SQL Docs team is one of many Docs teams for different products inside Microsoft's Cloud and AI DevRel team. So what is DevRel? In a greater role, developer relations is the team that involves activities that connect developers with external users. DevRel ensures that the products establish a good continuous relationship with external developers through mutual communication. So DevRel involves documentation, sure, but it also involves the reference docs for how to call an API or a code sample, tutorials and walkthroughs and things like that. DevRel in other companies might look like community management, issue reporting and triage, release notes, focus groups, Your favorite video game, for example, has DevRel folks to send and receive communication with the public about bugs, troubleshooting, patches, mods, discussion. DevRel folks are technical and they know the product well. That's important. In fact, some tech companies cycle DevRel folks in and out of DevRel positions, cycle developers in and out of DevRel positions, so that DevRel folks have a keen awareness of tech detail and developers have a keen awareness of how a user consumes the products and the communication. So at Microsoft, DevRel teams usually have a really strong technical background from consulting or support positions, either internal or external to the company. Most have experience with project management, technical writing, blogging, or book writing as well, because we are editing docs. And finally, DevRel is a strategic advantage. We were kind of talking about this before the meeting started. It's an advantage for product teams because this type of outreach enhances adoption and it provides authentic community engagement that goes beyond a marketing campaign or social media. Microsoft feels like its DevRel is a strategic advantage over competitors. So in a way, DevRel is not marketing to CIOs and CEOs. DevRel is marketing to developers, technical folks like you. And there are products out there that we've all used and we continue to use them because we've had good documentation experiences or support experiences, even if something went wrong, or because of easy adoption or smooth learning curves. Well, that's what we're trying to do in DevRel. So in that spirit of authentic community involvement, let's go ahead and dive in. First, I'm going to start with some tips and tricks on how to use Microsoft Docs, stuff you may not be aware of, stuff that's changed recently. Just to give you a map around navigating specific documents and some of the features that we have. I'm not going to explain every button here, but in the top right-hand corner, this one's new. The Save button allows you to save links to collections, and then you can organize your docs into groups that you might also use for a specific project or a certification exam that you're studying for. You can save your docs alongside Microsoft Learn modules that you've been taking or Microsoft Q&A pages to perhaps gather all the materials that you need in one place. And this is especially handy if you have to work on a shared computer or like for students and you don't have access to the browser's built-in bookmarks. You can use this built into the site. You'll also see two search boxes. The first one in the top right-hand corner searches the entire technology stack that you're in. For example, it searches all of Azure. Then there's a table of contents on the left-hand side, and there's another search box where you can search for titles inside a given table of contents. On the right, there's a table of contents. There's a navigation for the article itself, and it's here that you're going to see all the major headlines for the article. And those article headlines are linkable directly. If you hover over one, you'll see a little anchor icon appear for a link, and you can link straight to a heading specifically, and you'll notice that it appends it to the URL with that pound what's new, for example. So you can hover on that heading, see the link graphic appear, copy that URL, send that to a colleague, or send that or bookmark it for yourself for exactly where in the document you need to link. So where it makes sense, the same document is going to include different information for different versions of the product that are mentioned. We may use the same article with various versions of content. For example, in SQL Server, we might have different content for SQL on Windows versus SQL on Linux, or the different releases of SQL Server, 2016, 17, 19, things like that, or different Azure implementations of SQL Server, and sometimes all the above. So on the bottom left-hand corner, this is a code snippet of the Markdown. We're going to talk a lot more about Markdown later, but this is a code snippet of that Markdown showing how one article might display different content depending on the version that you've requested. Well, how do you know what version you have requested? On that left-hand side of the article, there's going to be a drop-down for some articles, not all. And for some articles, you're going to be able to choose which flavor of SQL Server you want. So if a doc doesn't look quite right, because of a version specific detail, make sure to look at the version that you've requested. The version drop-down lists in the top left-hand corner may come in handy, especially if you're working with a version of SQL Server that's not the most recent. The version drop-down is also affects the table of contents, so things may be included or excluded in the table of contents depending on the version that you have requested. Sometimes we'll handle versioning via tabs inside the document. Or we'll clearly state the versions in like an applies to line. And sometimes we'll use like colorful green and red boxes across the top to make sure you know what version of SQL the content covers. And also note that for content that's specific to older versions of SQL Server before SQL 2016, we do still have ways to access that content, even if some of those ways are through offline documentation downloads. And so while we support content for all the supported versions of SQL Server going back to 2012, just a friendly reminder that SQL 2012 support ends in about 1 year in July of 2022. So if you still have any SQL 2012 servers kicking around, it's time to make sure you have a migration planned for some time in the next year. Speaking of Management Studio, not a lot of people are still aware of this, but when you have any text highlighted in a query window in Management Studio, this also works for SQL Server Data Tools or any shell of Visual Studio. You hit F1, the browser should bring you right to the corresponding article for that word of syntax that you've highlighted. So this assumes that your workstation, 1, has access to the internet, and 2, you've selected the help preference for open in browser. There's also an offline help preference and offline files that you can download for offline reference. This will bring you right to the correct article, in this case for the dynamic management view for sys.dm exec sessions, pretty important DMV in SQL Server. If you hit F1 on something that's highlighted and it doesn't bring you to the right article or the one that you expected, that actually might be a docs issue. So that's something you could file an issue for. We're going to talk about that soon. So if your work environment is behind an air-gapped network, or if you work in a high security environment like a nuclear power plant, you can download version-specific docs offline through Management Studio. In fact, this is the only way to get SQL 2014 specific documentation, although it's pretty rare that you would need that specific documentation. So our documentation is actually, again, a strategic advantage for competitors in a special way. So there are very large organizations, including the public sector and the private sector, companies at the top of the Fortune list, that want their development environments to be internal and separated from the public internet. So that means developers don't have access to Google everything, but they still want to have all that documentation. In the case of Microsoft documentation for SQL Server and Power BI and everything in Azure, for example, all sorts of other products, all that documentation is hosted in GitHub, and therefore it can be easily cloned, brought down periodically, and then rehosted internally in those environments so that those customers can get the best of both worlds: secure network for development that's separated from the public internet, and fresh access to fresh documentation. Some of our competitors want to provide like a stack of PDFs or like a bunch of screen scrapes or scanned documents. I mean, come on, this is way better. Are there any questions at this point about anything that we've talked about so far? Any questions about docs in general?
No, that SSMS thing is cool. I was not aware of that.
You know, I wasn't either until I came to Microsoft. And it's probably because I started working after the point where most work machines are connected to the internet. So we just had Google. But I do remember Books Online, you know, the concept of that. If you're an old DBA like I am, you probably remember that Books Online thing is like the reference, what we used to call docs, essentially. But I think I was always using it electronically. I don't remember having to like access it in an offline fashion, except when I was in like school. I think I might have done that once, but yeah, it's way easier. Go ahead.
I was going to say, does that function work in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code?
So those are two different things. Yes, in Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code is actually a website running inside Windows. It's an Electron app. So Visual Studio Code and Azure Data Studio are completely different shell. That's why they're so much faster to load. It's why they pop open like that, as opposed to taking like 3 minutes to load up like a Visual Studio or a Management Studio does. Yeah. So no, this is definitely a feature of Visual Studio. And so Management Studio has it. SQL Server Data Tools has it. Yeah. And this isn't just SQL, by the way. This works for anything in Visual Studio. Good questions, though. Yeah, feel free to come off and mute. I'll keep going, but we can be informal about this. So how do you provide feedback? You found something in Docs. You're not sure it's right. you're not sure it's complete. There's three main ways to provide feedback to Microsoft. The first is, feedback.azure.com. That's mostly for product ideas or bug reports or like I wish I had this kind of thing. But then for documentation issues, there's two avenues. The first is GitHub issues and GitHub pull requests. And both of these act just as if you were contributing to any open source project on GitHub. And if you've never done that before, don't worry about it. It's super easy, but we use GitHub. We own GitHub now, but we use GitHub for our issues and pull requests in the same way that anybody would, any open source project on GitHub would. So contributing can be done easily through the browser without having to learn Git bash or install anything, without having to know what a fork or a clone or a push or a pull is. So if you have no idea, if you've never worked with Git before, don't worry about that. Don't be intimidated by that. You don't have to. I'm going to explain later on how that process works if you are into Git, if you kind of understand how that works, and you might be interested in that. And if you already work with Git or GitHub and you're familiar with pull requests because maybe you're in a more developer role, if you're familiar with how to set up a remote repository, for example, you can do that. And later, we're going to talk about how this process works behind the scenes. But in the case of SQL Docs, not a lot of DBAs are familiar with Git. I wasn't for a long time when I was a DBA, and that's not a problem. Anybody can help easily using the browser only. So we even have a step-by-step tutorial. So after this presentation, when you actually want to go and find something and fix it, docs.microsoft.com/contribute. It's going to be a step-by-step process to how to create a pull request. By contributing to Microsoft Docs for any technology or any product, you can be a part of that same community and help edit the docs that everyone uses. And we're going to talk about that contributor designation at the top of the article, at the top of every article, to make sure that you are recognized for your contributions to an article. And in those articles, we get like 16 million page views a month. Again, you can do this entirely through the browser, nothing to install if you want. And you're about to get an inside peek at this process that we call Docs as code. So content teams like mine, like the SQL team, across all the technologies, integrate with the product teams. We're on their support reviews and their pipeline meetings and their team meetings, and we coordinate on them with release schedules. So we are a part of the development process to get the docs out. So let's walk through it. So to be clear, what's a bug? Support issues don't belong in doc feedback or the feedback channel that we're talking about next. The feedback options that we're about to discuss are not Microsoft support. We have no SLA for response time. So if you're having a problem or an unexpected behavior or an outage, contact Microsoft support, your support partner. We triage incoming issues and pull requests in GitHub. And if it sounds like a support issue or like you're having a real big problem right now, your issue is likely going to be closed with a polite message and some links to go open a support issue where an engineer is going to be able to help you with that. Most docs issues that get attention are a request to fix something that's missing or outdated or wrong, or a request to add something that would have helped prevent an error or an outage, etc. So if you've got feedback, again, you have three options. The first option is feedback.azure.com, which is where product feedback, suggestions, reproducible bug reports, all this stuff, that's not really a docs issue. This is more of a product feedback issue. That's either for support or maybe it's for feedback.azure.com. So if you've been around a few years, you might actually remember we used to have something called the Connect system with Connect items. A few years ago, those were all shut down and migrated into the feedback.azure.com portal, which is why some of them look older. That's the place for comments and suggestions for the products now. So this is external to us. This is actually managed by the product teams themselves. And it's where a lot of really good usability ideas and bug reports come from, and it is open to the public for anybody to contribute to. So to give feedback on any product, on any docs page, at the bottom, you're going to see a box at the bottom of the article to click on this product, and you will get to the feedback.azure.com page for that product. Here's what it looks like. This is the SQL Server page for feedback.azure.com, where you can submit comments or suggestions and vote on ideas too. And there are many pages like this from many different Microsoft products going down the right-hand side of the page. You might see a lot of these on social media. If someone wants to get, if someone has a good suggestion and they want to get the product team's attention with a whole lot of votes in its favor. And so you see here a suggestion for dark theme for SQL Server Management Studio. I'm a big fan of dark themed apps. I hope we get that one day. So let's say you've got a documentation issue to suggest. Think of this, think of an issue as just something's wrong. You go fix it, Microsoft. We have goals to address these issues in a timely manner, but we'll be honest, issues are triaged. They might take days or weeks to get a satisfactory resolution. Not all issues will become a documentation change. So to create an issue, you're going to use the other button in that gray box at the bottom of every article, most articles actually, to use the This Page button, and then you're going to come to this page. This is in github.com now. Here's the new issue screen. You'll throw your comments in here, give it a title, and then hit Submit New Issue. We'll take it from there. So, and if you weren't aware, github.com itself has a dark mode. Actually, very nice. I don't know how many of you prefer to work in dark mode, dark themed apps and websites as much as possible. Yeah, I've seen some thumbs up. I know I do. This is kind of a polarizing issue in the community, by the way. I'm all the way dark side. And you can actually change this when github.com, you logged into your profile page. They have a little button there, a little kitty cat appears. I think you can change it in a couple other places too in your settings. And then if you're an enthusiast for dark mode websites, docs.microsoft.com, the site that I work on, has a dark theme as well. At the bottom of every page in the footer, you'll see a theme and you can change it from light to dark. Also coming soon, rumor is that Microsoft Word and LinkedIn will both have dark themes. I'm really looking forward to that as well. All right, enough about dark mode stuff. I'll stop talking about that, unless you want to talk about it more, in which case we can talk about it. Back to contributing. So the third option, you've got a documentation issue and you want to suggest the edits yourself. You click on an edit button in the top right-hand corner of the article. Most articles are going to have this edit button. And that's going to bring you to this page. This is the actual page for the article in GitHub. The page that you actually see on docs.microsoft.com is rendered by a DocFX engine that's a custom engine developed by Microsoft to render its docs. This is the actual Markdown file for the article. And so then here, like any other file in GitHub, you can click on the pencil button. And if you don't already have a fork created for this repository, in this case, the SQL Docs repository, GitHub will automatically create one for you. You don't have to worry about that. You click on this pencil in red, and then you're going to end up on an edit screen for the actual Markdown code of the article. And you can do this right now for any article that you see. It might surprise you then to learn that Microsoft Docs are not edited in Microsoft Word, but rather they're edited in code. So Markdown, in most cases, and then YAML in some others. So Markdown is a lightweight text markup language created for formatting rich text with a plain text editor. GitHub has their own formal implementation of Markdown called GitHub Flavored Markdown. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't know Markdown, I don't recognize any of this stuff, that's okay, actually. Many different online sites use Markdown for their content, including GitHub, but also GitLab, Reddit, Stack Exchange, Bitbucket, Drupal, and a lot more. So you might actually already be more familiar with Markdown than you think. So make your changes here. If you're not familiar with Markdown, it's pretty easy to understand once you get rolling with it. But don't worry about being perfect. Don't worry about the styling so much. The content team will always review your content submission and potentially tweak it to adhere to Microsoft standards about styling, punctuation, capitalization, stuff like that before it's merged live. So we're always going to fix that. There are plenty of resources online for the basic Markdown syntax if you want to review, but if you don't get something quite right, again, don't sweat it.
Couple questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
So like sites that use Markdown often have some way of posting an image. Like you either need to have an image that you've loaded to some website somewhere that you can link to. Some of them let you upload. Is there a way to do that?
That's a great question. And it's not something that we usually request from the general public. We have artists internally to build images to a standardized way. If you'd like to submit a screenshot as like proof of what you see, you could do that in a Git issue. A Git pull request is, here's the changes you actually want to see, and you don't have to whip out Photoshop or anything like that to make the image look right. If you have a problem with an image, it'd probably be better to open up an issue if it's just the image, or just mention that in the notes of the pull request. Because I don't think it's very easy to upload images through the same. We have upload disabled for most of our public repositories, so I don't think that would be something that you would need to worry about.
And a Git issue is what you described earlier, where you hit feedback and then this page.
Correct. So there's three things I mentioned. There's the connect, there's the Git issues, and there's the Git pull request. So now we're actually looking at the Markdown. That means you're in a pull request, which means you're going in and you're editing the thing yourself. A lot of times this is actually easier. For example, if you had to describe the problem with the third bullet, second sentence where the apostrophe isn't in quite the right place, it's probably just easier to go in and change the apostrophe yourself, right? And so we actually see that a lot of times, that people waste too much time on like sentences, and they've got to go back and forth when they could have just done it themselves. And sometimes they just go and move the star, the asterisk, or the apostrophe themselves. In a pull request, much easier for everybody involved, right?
So another question that's related to that one is, like, let's say, and I actually have a specific example that I'm dealing with right now on Azure. In the healthcare space, there's some new requirements that people are trying to follow, like, you know, and you want to document whether you're following them, like whether you're using TLS 1.2 for your transfer, your encryption during data transfer in all portions of your Azure environment. So that includes like between VMs and other things, means between like regions, all this stuff. And there's all these things I need to be able to document right now about that. The pages that deal with encryption in transit on Azure just say we use encryption in transit lots of places. You can enable it and disable it. And there's not a lot of details there about like how you can tell whether it's enabled in different places so you can document it. So like I could lay out the framework for how a section like that should be structured for somebody who's trying to verify that they're in compliance. But I don't actually know where to find the answers. And so it would be like, I could lay it out. I might even say, hey, an image or a diagram that shows this kind of stuff would be really good here, but I don't have one. Is there a way to say, here's what I think you should make this look like, but there's a few pieces that I don't know the answer to, and how would you do that?
That sounds like a Git issue, not a pull request, because you don't have the answers. You could still do it in a pull request just by using like little comment articles to like put an image that looks like this here. Obviously, we don't commit exactly your text automatically, so it's not any danger of that. But a Git issue would be a good way to describe, hey, for this article, an image that shows this would be great. Details on which version of TLS is between these two things would be great. Stuff like that, kind of a punch list would probably be a Git issue.
Okay. So you only use a pull request if you know the answer completely, and you can write out exactly.
Not completely. If you know even part of the answer, or if you want to just take a guess and then write ... to fill in the rest of it, pull request is just fine for that. Either way, it goes to the same team. It's really going to go to the same process. We're going to be asking the same questions to the product team. We're going to be talking to the same people. There's not really a divergence of the pathway on the back end between an issue and a pull request. One thing the pull request does give you, though, when you open a pull request, is that contributor status. If you put a commit in and then we change it, we modify it, but then we end up committing a chain of commits that included yours, now you're listed as a contributor on the article. We love to see that. We know you love to see that. We know people in the community love to see that. That's a big plus for PRs. Pull request gets you contributor status. An issue is fine, but you don't get any recognition for that publicly, or we don't have a way to recognize you for that. There's actually one other way that we could recognize you for that. That's use that hashtag that I'm going to have, the ping MSFT docs. You can use that in GitHub. You can use that on Twitter. You can use that on LinkedIn. And that's a way to kind of say, hey, I just put in something, and that's a way for us to recognize you. Otherwise, we don't really know who you are aside from your GitHub account whenever you're putting in an issue or a pull request. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, cool. Great questions so far. Keep them coming. So in your pull request, you can make your changes. You can make your changes to the text. Again, they don't have to be perfect. They do not have to be complete. You can say, I'm going to fix this sentence, but then maybe another sentence right here. Just put that in a comment or something like that. No problem. Then you can preview your changes using that red button to preview your changes there. And that's just a preview in GitHub of the Markdown. And that's okay. Then at the bottom, once you've made your changes, you're going to scroll down there. Here's your chance to commit. So you're going to enter your pull requests title and your comments. You're going to give a description. You're going to use ping MSFT docs. We'll talk more about that later, but that's just a way for you to say hi on GitHub or Twitter. And that's just to say hi to the team. It's a way for us to see if you heard about it from us. Then choose create a new branch. And this is actually the only option, the only radio button that will be enabled for you. Unlike some open source projects, we will not allow you to commit code straight to our live repository. So don't worry about that. You'll notice that it gives a new branch a simple name here, your username, patch, and then an ordinal number of the number of branches that you've created. That's fine. You don't have to worry about changing the branch name or anything like that. If you're not familiar with the GitHub terminology like branches and pull requests, again, don't worry. You don't have to be. Once you submit your pull request by clicking that green button, we'll take it from there. We'll keep you updated.
Can you create a branch that involves multiple pages?
So you can definitely through the GitHub UI, it's kind of one-to-one in this case. What you can do though is create a pull request with multiple commits against the same branch. So a pull request is really saying, I want this branch to pick up stuff from this branch. So through this UI, you can't create a branch with more than one file, but you can create the branch with one file and then add more files to that same branch, which are then picked up in the same pull request. I guess short answer to the question is yes, but not right here.
Sure.
You can then go back into the pull request, add more edits to different files. Yes.
Right. So you do that with your, whatever Git desktop tool you use, or maybe even the Git website.
Entirely in the browser. Entirely in the browser. If you want to use GitHub desktop, it's going to want to clone the whole repo down. I'm going to talk about that in a sec. You'll actually have all the docs on your workstation like that because it's an open source project like anything. And then you can do it all through that if you want to. You can do it entirely within the browser though.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. Because a lot of people are like, well, if I want to make a second edit to that same document, do I have to go through this whole process again with the same pull request? No, you can edit that same document, have multiple commits for the same document in one pull request that all gets treated the same. In fact, on the next page, I think I show that. Yeah, so here's what it looks like after you've submitted your pull request. Let's see. Yeah. Let me mention this. Your changes to the markdown of the file will be proposed for merge. There's a process in the back end that you don't really see. It'll be triaged. It'll be reviewed by somebody on whatever team is appropriate by identifying the author of the article and its reviewers. So that may be me, and maybe somebody else, depending on the article. The content team for the article then takes it from there. We'll reply to the PR in its comments. I'm going to show you that later. We'll make edits if necessary. We'll merge the code in, and you'll be notified along the way with that feedback directly from one of us on the content team. So this is what it looks like after you've submitted a pull request. Your PR pull request will start in an open status. You can see this one already has that purple merged status. This one's already done, which means it's been accepted and it's pushed into a preview repo where it'll soon be merged into the real thing. Talk about that in a sec. But you can see what GitHub did for you was to automatically, in the background, create a fork and then create a branch here in the user's name, Hiroshi's name. And then on the pull request, it includes your commit right there. That's the line in the pull request log for your commit. Pull request, again, can include many commits for many different files. And now at the bottom, you can use this PR log. It's going to contain both the automated and the manually created message. You see that Christine responded here to Hiroshi, but then it also has a bunch of automated messages as well. You'll receive an email from GitHub anytime anyone uses your username with the @ symbol, and you can respond in conversation. Sometimes we'll have more clarifying questions or, hey, what version of this did you see? Stuff like that that we'll go back and forth on in the PR. Once your pull request has been created, both you and Microsoft can review the changes that you're suggesting. This is the net changes of any number of commits in the Files Changed tab, and this will give you an in-browser differential. So red is the old code, green is the new, and the changed characters are highlighted. And so you can see right here, they're just moving the 2 asterisks, which is the GitHub Markdown for bold. They're just moving that to a different place. This is one of those cases, and I'd like to show it because it's just way easier to do a pull request for this as opposed to trying to say the 2 asterisks are in the wrong place. You got to move them here, right? So in fact, you're probably going to find a pull request for stuff like this if you find something like this easier. If you're trying to describe how something should change, simply making the change yourself, probably more straightforward sometimes. If you still wanted to make more changes, like say you spot another typo or something like that, you can click the 3 dots right here and then click the Edit File button, and then you can submit another change to another commit to the same branch in the same pull request. After you've submitted your pull request, you can sit back though. We got it from here, and we'll let you know if we have questions in the status update. So those are your 3 options. Now, which of these is most helpful to Microsoft? Which gives you contribution credit? Only the 3rd option, only a pull request. That's actually what we want to see most of. And then after your pull request is in, you can say hi to us on Twitter, ping MSFT Docs, Twitter or GitHub or whatever. We'll probably see it, and that's a way, again, for us to recognize you for your contribution. If you've contributed, go ahead.
I was going to say, can someone begin an entirely new article using a branch?
Great question. It's not something we typically do. There's a lot that actually goes into a new article. There's some metadata on the back end. We got to link it up in a table of contents. So submitting a net new article is not something that we ask for. You could do that in a GitHub issue, like, hey, say we need a new article for something like this. But it'd be difficult for us to kind of wire that up to allow a member of the general public to add an article, just because all the other stuff that needs to go on in the background for that. So it's not something I've seen. Make sense?
Yep.
Adding to an existing article, though, sometimes we'll split the articles up if you've added enough content. I've seen that happen before, actually. Where, hey, there's a whole nother case for this. Here's a step-by-step walkthrough of how to do this. Well, that might just become its own article, and we might do that on the back end.
So if I really thought there needed to be another page, the way to do it would be to submit a 1,000-line pull request for an existing article, and you'd be like, oh yeah, this is and it's use. You'll be like, okay, we're gonna add this.
Yeah, that'd probably be a good way to do it. And then in the notes you can also reach out and say, hey, this probably needs to be its own article. Yeah. Good question. Not the first time we've had that question. Some people really want to contribute like a whole blog post. There's an audience for that. We actually have other ways to contribute that kind of community content and samples, for example. For docs, we typically don't field those kind of things from the public. But it could definitely happen if you give us enough content. So, but once you've contributed to an article via a pull request, and again, only via a pull request, not an issue, and we merge your commit eventually into the document, you'll get your GitHub profile picture at the top row of the article. The folks listed here are both of those inside and external to Microsoft. You see Hiroshi's name there. He's external to Microsoft in Japan because they have all submitted commits to this article. And you only get your name and your logo up here for a pull request. And this contribution can be kind of proof for your MVP application for your renewal activity. All right, so if you're not sure how it should change, just give it a shot. If it's not quite right, if it's not formatted perfectly, if you don't have the name of the product quite right or whatever, don't worry about it. We'll adjust it, but at least you've drawn attention to it. At least it'll get fixed. And I kind of answered this question before. Images, graphics need to be updated. We have designers internally to get things standardized. You can just kind of describe. You don't need to open up Photoshop and edit any images yourself. Capitalization is tough. We get it. Various features and products inside Microsoft. Capitalization is one of the most nuanced bits there is about publishing. Marketing usually wins. Marketing always wins these arguments about how to capitalize things, regardless of how a product's name evolved throughout the development process. So it can be more difficult for us sometimes than the general public to capitalize things. We just had a big pull request come through, for example, with a lot of different articles to make capitalization changes that were mostly misguided. So again, that task is tricky enough when you have it directly from the inside sources like we do. So we'll handle the capitalization part. If you spot inconsistencies between marketing content and documentation and learn content, for example, point it out. Don't be afraid to point out things like that. That's good. You should know that we're regularly discussing and working on that stuff internally. Don't be afraid to point something like that out. But for example, product names and feature names are difficult to get just right, especially when the thing is in the product name. So for example, Azure SQL Database or Azure Managed Instance or Azure Firewall or stuff like that. Just because we have a product called Azure SQL Database does not mean that every word database is now capitalized. This is even more difficult for our international partners and customers because capitalization often means a product or a service name should be translated, shouldn't be translated, or should be translated in this specific way. But a lowercase common noun of the same term should be translated. So inconsistency in that capitalization confuses translators. It confuses customers. We don't like that. That consistency is important, and it's part of the core goals of our brand voice, which is above all to be simple and to be human. So if we can do a better job at that, let us know.
Can I ask a question related to that?
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
It seems like periodically Microsoft comes out with two products that do very different things that have the same name. Like one that's been sort of annoying the last couple of years is data flows, which occur in at least two different places for two different things and two different products. Like, is that usually just an oops? They were developing along parallel paths and they didn't check, or do you know how that happens?
Probably not. So data flows exist in Azure Data Factory, but also in Synapse. Is that
Power BI too?
Oh, and Power BI too? In Power BI, that, yeah. In that case, that's probably one of those things is a generic data flow, and one of those things is actually a product called data flows. That actually has also happened in the Azure Monitor space, where we have a feature called SQL Insights that's inside the Azure SQL database. But then Azure Monitor has a specific thing for SQL Server, for monitoring SQL Server, called, you guessed it, SQL Insights. One of those has a space in it. One of those is kind of a one-word mishmash, SQL Insights. And that's because one of those was a feature that we just kind of added on. It's actually the name of a library of monitoring tools. It's not even a feature. And one of those is an actual product. And so in that case, those things can step on each other. And that's probably how data flows happened as well. Sure. Especially because both of those in those cases are pretty generic, data flows, in one case, I bet you it's not capitalized. In another, it is. Is that the case? Yeah, that's probably why. Now, between Azure Data Factory and Synapse, it's actually the same thing, because data flows in Synapse is Azure Data Factory. It's the same product, just Synapse is this amalgamation of a lot of different products put together into one self-service platform. It's one of the reasons it's pretty cool and pretty stable in that sense. It's not just like a whole cloth recreation of a lot of different things. But it's, I understand that the terminology can feel like it's overlapping, even though it's different products. Yeah. I bet you each one of those is kind of special in its own way as to how it's evolved, though. That might be worth asking the team if you ever get access to them at a conference or something like that. How did you manage that? Good stuff. Let me talk a little bit about and great question again. Let me talk a little bit about contributions for localization issues, such as a translation issue. So if you've got a translation issue to raise, because you've been reading a non-English version of the documentation, for example, those are actually all submitted by email now. And this process changed within the last year. You can download an Outlook email template from here, aka.ms/docsitelockfeedback. Submit your feedback in any language. It will be translated and routed to the correct team. If you've got a technical issue with an article and you're most comfortable submitting your issue in another language than English, no problem. Instead of creating a pull request in English, you can just use this email template, and it will be translated and passed on to the proper content team. For example, my content team. Either way, thanks for contributing to Microsoft Docs and making them better for everyone, everywhere. So now that you've seen how you can contribute to Docs, let's briefly show how to get some inside baseball and talk about how we use GitHub to host Microsoft documentation. Bala, I don't know if you're a baseball fan, but San Diego is really good this year. Baseball reference. I don't know. And Seattle, we're not very good this year. as most years. So behind the scenes, Microsoft Docs are edited in Markdown and YAML. We've already talked about Markdown. YAML is used for tables of contents and frequently asked questions articles, where that format is better for SEO, search engine optimization. YAML is also a plain text markup language used for structuring or serializing data. But we spend a lot of our time in Visual Studio Code or Azure Data Studio to edit docs. We have other tools to help with automated link checking, syntax formatting. We have tools for bulk edits, a series of include files to tokenize things like product name and product versions. We have a rich set of metadata for each article, and we do pay attention to how articles perform in terms of SEO and traffic and trends, all driven through Azure Analytics, and we query them with Custo queries. We try to improve poorly performing articles, and we use many different metrics to track the performance of an article, including, for example, if you copy text from an article, that's good. That shows up. If you click through, or if you scroll or dwell, any of the same kind of metrics that any website uses these days to kind of measure how effective a web page is, we track that without capturing any personal information or wider tracking information. For big article updates, we have systems to handle what's called a release branch for when we want to work on documentation for months and months at a time, and then we want to release it all at once during the Ignite conference keynote, for example, right? So we have different mechanisms in the background to do that, usually managed through essentially GitHub branches. So here's some behind the scenes in how Microsoft Docs and Git works, specifically in GitHub, which runs Git, where all Microsoft documentation is managed. If you're new to Git and you don't understand this, don't worry. As we've explained to contributors in the community, this is actually all managed for you. So here's the basic GitHub workflow. Let's step through it. A repository like Azure Docs is where the source is housed and where the website engine pulls Markdown to present you a live website. A fork is a copy of the repository of all the files in it set up to your account in GitHub. So I've created a fork for all the different repos that I work in, and I have associated with my GitHub account a copy of Azure Docs, a copy of SQL Docs, for example. And then to tell the two repos apart, a common convention is to reference your remote fork as origin, and then the code base you eventually push to is called upstream. That's just a convention that comes with Git. These are called remote names or just remotes, and they're common naming conventions. You can actually choose any name for your remotes. So you will have an origin and then upstream for every repo that you work in. Then a clone is a copy of a fork that's actually brought down locally to your workstation so that you can make edits. So you clone your own fork. And when you go to make changes to a file or to add or remove files, you'll be creating what's called a working branch. It's relevant to the chunk of changes that you'll be making. And you want to only have relevant changes grouped together inside that branch. You want a branch because it's going to move back upstream according to a specific feature or issue that you're addressing. And you want it to be treated as a block of changes as it goes back upstream. So your work goes into the branch. And here the branch is just called, ISO date, very common convention, fix issue. And we'd probably put a little bit more info in there. This is just the name of the branch. You can put all sorts of comments later. When you're done, first you will commit the branch locally to your own clone in your own workstation, but still on your workstation. It hasn't hit the cloud yet. Then you will push the commit to your origin in github.com, the fork of the code in your GitHub account. Now, at this point, Microsoft has no idea that you've done this. We don't know or care, and you haven't really, told anybody about this change that you've made. In order to do that, you need to create what's called that pull request, asking Microsoft Docs repository to accept changes from your repository so that your changes can be merged into the main repo from your fork into the main upstream repository.
So
now,
if we're creating the branch locally,
yep,
that means we can name it whatever we want, right?
Oh yeah, in either case, you can name it whatever you want. That auto name thing, like username -patch-1 or whatever before, is just a suggestion. You can name the branches whatever you want. I suggest, because the timestamp isn't always visible in the PR logs, I suggest putting an ISO date in your branches and in your commits. Just makes things a little easier to read sometimes, depending on how you're consuming that data. But yeah, either way, you can name the branch whatever it is that you like.
When you say ISO date, you just mean that 8-digit date format?
Yeah. ISO date, that's just like a common data convention. You put the year, then the month, then the days, and then it sorts numerically correctly, right? If you do year, month, year, day, month, year, or month, day, year, either way, it doesn't sort correctly if you just numerically sort it, right? Year, month, day, it's called an ISO date. That's the thing. And then, an ISO date time could also have hours, minutes, seconds, and it all descends so that it sorts correctly, even if you're sorting it like a number. Much easier to deal with. And there's no slashes or dashes, and you don't have to worry about, because of course we're an international team, and I deal with teams overseas a whole lot. You don't have to worry about them misunderstanding day, month, or month, day, year. ISO date makes all that stuff clear.
ISO dates are awesome.
Yeah. And if you've ever had to convert non-ISO dates to ISO dates, or like Julian dates to ISO dates, you know exactly the pain that I describe here.
That's interesting. I'd never heard ISO dates referred to in this way. I'd always thought it was like the 4-week month, 4-week month, then 5-week month pattern that you use sometimes for certain kinds of businesses.
Well, there's that ISO week concept. Yeah,
right.
Where some months, some years have 52 ISO weeks, and some years have 53 ISO weeks, and then there's like a 0th ISO week sometimes.
And you want to have each quarter have like 13 weeks in it, and so it gets weird.
ISO just comes from like an international standards organization, and it's just a way for everybody to agree on basic date time things. But an ISO date is just what we're looking at here. And this is just the date format that they have set down. I just use it, not that I credit ISO with this, it just makes a whole lot of sense because it sorts correctly. Again, right? ISO week stuff, that kind of math is really confusing as well. It has to do with like what's the first Tuesday of the year. That's actually the first week of the year. So you could have January 1st actually be in the ISO week of the previous year. That stuff gets confusing. Okay, so that's the basic. In reality, let me explain it a little closer to the reality of how we work internally. We actually have 2 repositories in the Microsoft Docs account. The Azure Docs repository drives the website, but like true professionals, we do not develop against production. We only develop in a preview repository, that -PR repository, which you can't see. It's not public. It's only internal to Microsoft, which allows us to work in and preview the merged state of our changes in the actual live repository. And this build process to the live website usually occurs about twice a day, and it's gated by a team of build reviewers. But when you submit pull requests, you don't have to worry about that. Your workflow, all the validation, all the steps necessary for your PR occurs inside the public Azure Docs repo or SQL Docs repo or whatever it is that the article sends you to when you hit the edit button. And again, this is the same Docs as code pattern applies to any Microsoft technology, any product in Microsoft Docs. So any questions about this? How many of you are familiar with Git and GitHub? Yeah.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
Oh, great. So yeah, you can do this the same way using the GitHub desktop or just Git Bash. Yeah, we all use Git Bash just because it makes it easier. Sometimes we have to get into hairy situations where we're pulling in different commits from different pull requests and different repositories, stuff like that. Just Git Bash makes it easier to use that sometimes. But you can do it totally the same way if you know what you're doing in GitHub desktop as well for Windows or any other tool to issue Git commands.
Question that you might not be comfortable answering. So I have a client who's doing GitHub for all their DevOps stuff, and then they want to use Azure DevOps pipelines to promote their code. And so they're like debating about whether or not to switch to Azure DevOps for their code version control. You guys own both things. Are they merging?
Yeah, I can't make any. I honestly don't know, but I couldn't make any future speaking statements to begin with. I don't know if they're ever going to do that. I think GitHub has a lot of open source community, and Azure DevOps has a lot of corporate and enterprise community to it. And I think they're both just fine existing as they are because they serve different audiences. That'd just be my analysis of the market. Behind the scenes, they're both Git. DevOps is not GitHub specifically; it's still DevOps Git. But yeah, the way you interact with them though, with all the pipeline stuff, I'm pretty sure you can do both in both. You can do all of that.
DevOps totally supports using what you're suggesting, Jeremiah, that you use GitHub for version source control and everything, and then use DevOps for all the pipelines, all the orchestration stuff, and the reviewer and all that kind of stuff.
And that's how we do it.
You just have to have you just got to have 2 browser windows up, and then as opposed to 1. So I mean, that's the only thing that I'm aware of. But
yeah. Well, if it's an open source project, then GitHub has some advantages there. If it's not, then yeah, maybe DevOps is a lot more internalized, and it's there's still a whole lot of linkage that we have between our DevOps because we live in DevOps all the time. Of course, I had to learn that coming on board, and we have all sorts of linkages between DevOps and our GitHub repository. So I'm still confident you could link all that up. But yeah, it'd be in 2 different cloud engines, I suppose.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, not exactly my expertise, but yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, cool. Good questions, everybody. So again, you can do all this through github.com. And if you're interested in learning more about Git or GitHub, here's some really good resources from Microsoft Learn you can use. And this recording to be made available. I can also make available the PowerPoint to the user group.
Yes, absolutely. We have started putting this out on YouTube. So
awesome.
The slide deck, yeah, if you can email me, I'll get that pushed up somewhere.
I will shoot that over to you right away.
So I had a question. You were talking about the analytics, right? That definitely makes a lot of sense about them reviewing their website, the web page analytics, the click-through rates and whatnot. Does the team also do like Google search analytics to essentially get ideas for new pages, I guess, like to see like what are the people searching for, right? Because like going to Microsoft Docs is definitely one of the primary places I usually get there from a Google search because Google search is no one's ever going to beat it, right? I never go to Docs, search for it, and find it directly in Docs. I do a Google search and then make my way to Docs. But then from Docs, I go back to Google to find people's blogs. So I'm just curious, like the later part, that's I don't even know what kind of research you guys could do to gain insights, but is that something that happens?
Yeah, I don't think that we farm new ideas from the Google search traffic, but we definitely look at those things to see if they're hitting this page and they're abandoning it really quickly because it's not what they wanted. Then maybe we could improve the linkage, or we could improve other things about that page, right, to make sure that it's addressing the questions better. Keywords aren't a thing anymore, so it really is reading the page to try to get it. So we do look at those things a lot. And you're right. In some articles, 95% of the traffic comes from organic search, so from a search engine, not from internal references. We pay attention to that too. How could we have people end up on this page better? One of the things actually I want to show is this, which is we introduced this in February, actually. And so you probably noticed this at the bottom of a lot of Microsoft Docs articles. The links in this content are generated by a machine learning solution. And it's based on a model of like how customers behave inside the articles, what they click on and what they're looking for, what they end up at. And so we're actually providing you these links as recommended content at the bottom of a lot of articles in an effort to get you to what you were looking for. And we've actually seen really positive metrics on tracking traffic to these recommended articles so far. So we really think this is helpful in helping people find what they need.
Oh, that's
But-
really interesting. I thought that was you guys curating that. I didn't know that it's basically the people
Yeah.
who bought also bought thing.
Yeah.
Like, I have
Yeah.
I do find that very useful.
The see also and the next steps that you might see at the bottom, or if there's a button at the bottom to keep learning or stuff like that, that is written, right?
Mhm.
This is dynamic based on that machine learning content.
Nice.
Yeah, so we do look at what search terms people come to our pages on. I haven't heard of anybody going like, oh, hey, we don't have an article on this. We have a lot of other ways to figure out what new articles have, and we have a lot of work to do. So we don't spend a lot of time just like dredging for new article ideas. Maybe we should. Good question though. I got a couple more slides. Let's see. Also in Docs, you can add certifications to your login to docs.microsoft.com by permanently connecting your certification profile in Microsoft Learn to your docs.microsoft.com profile, which may be a different account if you maybe joined one before the other. You can go to your profile in Learn or in Docs to get here, and then go to certifications, then click on certification profile. You can get notifications for certification renewals and a lot more, and link directly to Pearson VUE to schedule the exams that you're pursuing, or to Learn to schedule the courses that you're pursuing right there. So it's all kind of connected. And then Inspire's coming up in a week. And then, yeah, that's all. That's actually all the content I got. So if you have any more questions, or did I answer your last question? Okay.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. Well, hey, thanks for the great questions. This has been a fantastic audience as far as questions goes. Thanks very much for all that. Is there anything else I can talk to you about today?
No, I just wanted to give a shout out to you, William, to say I thought you did a really great job. I've learned something new that I'm going to take back to work tomorrow.
Awesome.
So
Awesome.
for me. So just thanks.
Yeah, and I know we've told you how to do it, but you still got to go find something wrong, right? And our docs are actually pretty good. So we have not seen like an immediate bump in like all this traffic coming in of like typo corrections and stuff like that, because hopefully our docs don't have a lot of that stuff. So we understand that it might be a while until you find something that's just perfect for that first good PR. When you do, though, let us know so that we can give you that contribution credit. Aside from just the top of the article, we can hit you on Twitter or something like that. Good stuff. Cool. I know that before joining Microsoft, the only reasons I ever created a PR or an issue were to point out stuff because I was writing a book for Microsoft Press at the time, or when I would just be blogging and I'd find something wrong. And instead of like going to my blog to rip Microsoft a new one, I would actually put in a PR and then go to my blog and rip Microsoft a new one. One of them just, the latter felt more productive. But that's, you still got to find it. You just got to find something wrong. And hopefully our docs are actually serving you pretty well. But, in the case they're not, that's why we open it up to the wisdom of the crowd, right?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I think when we were first talking about setting up this presentation, right, I just happened to have actually submitted a issue.
Nice.
I mean,
go all the way through?
Yeah, so I was actually I was pretty impressed. So it wasn't on the SQL Docs side. This is on the app service certificate, some very convoluted thing. Basically, one of the newer features is you have a managed certificate that you can get for app services.
Uh-huh.
And it supports reading it straight out of a key vault, so you don't have to like extract a certificate and load it in.
Right.
But in this obscure feature, it doesn't support the newer RBAC permissions for key vault. It supports the older key vault's built-in security model. And I mean, the only reason I did it is because it took me 3 days of putzing around to figure out that was why. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
I have to put in something. And sure enough, they put a big purple box.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Hey,
yeah, they said like
something really good if they put it in a purple box. We don't only have so many purple boxes. We only use those when they're really important.
Yeah, but so they acknowledged the ticket. I don't even think it was well inside 24 hours, and then
Yeah,
within a
good.
couple days they came back. They're like, "Yep, we confirmed. We're putting in a PR." I was like, "Holy crap! Like this was
You did
fast."
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm gonna be honest, sometimes issues take a lot more than that a lot more time to get addressed or to, yeah, just because we get a lot of them and there's only so many of us. But that's great. That's great. Usually if it's a
This,
slam dunk, it gets addressed faster than others. Go ahead.
I thought of one I should have done last year, which is I was waiting sort of with bated breath for the release of Power BI XMLA endpoint. And the release page for Phase 2 2020 said, will be released in September of 2020. And it was like early November, and it still said released in September 2020. And I was
Yeah.
like, when is it going to be ready? So
That's
that
the
would have been a good one.
trickiest. So first off, we're not supposed to put forward-looking promises on docs. So that was probably a goof by somebody because we're for the exact situation that you just encountered. We're not supposed to make future promises. We can say stuff is not supported currently, but we can't say stuff is going to come out later this year because, stuff happens. But two, temporal stuff like that is always the trickiest stuff to keep up with in SQL, and when a new version comes out, when, SQL V Next comes out, we're going to have a ton of work combing through things, just looking for various keywords and stuff like that. So that's always the trickiest stuff. You're probably going to find something along those lines, especially after a big inflection point, like a new version coming out. Yeah.
Do you guys have a way, either in your Markdown language or in some other GitHub property or something, where you can identify things that you have a good idea are going to be dated, so you can more efficiently find them? Like, as a person who's built out large documentation solutions, I've experienced that pain. Do you have any tricks for doing that well?
Yeah, it'd be tricky just to put like a generic is dated, because all articles are in theory dated like that. And so really it just requires that domain expertise. That's why we're all SQL people, right? We have to know this kind of stuff. We do have some flags for things like, for example, if it mentions an Azure region or like a new product or a new thing that's in preview right now is only supported in certain regions around the world. We flag that because if a region gets renamed or moved or terminated or something like that, I don't know if that's happened. But we would flag the article to be able to hunt down things like regional mentions. And we have a couple other things like that. Otherwise, articles we try to write them as permanently as possible. We try to point out things in a finite way as opposed to an open-ended way. So, yeah, it's still the trickiest part. Yeah.
So does that really mean that you guys are taking putting an actual effort to not include screenshots, because especially in the Azure space, everything changes. Like,
Oh yeah, in the
your
early days, there
screenshot
were
is
so
like a
many
week.
screenshots that were out of date like 2 weeks later.
I think
I'm
every
still a
screenshot
picture
is a
guy. It just
lifespan
makes
of-
it so much easier for me to like, oh,
Yep.
there it is, instead of like, oh, I gotta read 100 words.
I know that I specifically avoid screenshots for that reason, just because, oh man, this is gonna be dated like within the next month or so. I would much rather a diagram, but on a walkthrough or a tutorial article, there's nothing that beats a picture like that. And so yeah, we'll put pictures out there. It's kind of up to the author to tickle themselves to go update those kind of things when they happen, though. To go refresh a screenshot, and there's nothing more painful than refreshing a screenshot. We have yeah.
Do you have any general, so we've been talking about so I've done actually quite a lot of relatively moderate to large scale documentation solutions for things that I've been involved with developing. And I've done stuff in OneNote, which has worked really well for small audiences on projects. I've done stuff in some old school wiki programs. I've done stuff in Jira. Do you have any general suggestions for somebody who does this periodically that is really interested in trying to do it better and more efficiently and more maintainably?
Interesting. Being able to see a version history of articles is actually more useful than you might think. So I know in OneNote you can get some versions where it does auto saves. And like some wikis have it. So make sure you have something like that. If it's just like a notepad or something like that, or a wiki without history, that can be actually kind of painful because you want to be able to see who and how something has changed recently. Versioning is really tricky. So we actually have some behind the scenes things called monikers to help show maybe a line, maybe a section, or maybe like the kind of the whole article differently depending on the version that you've requested. So you remember we kind of talked about that at the beginning, those moniker ranges and that selector where you can pick what version of the article you want to see. And so allowing something like that to be able to see a specific, otherwise you got to tangle your paragraphs up with, well, this works in this version, but not in this version, and this works in this version, but not in that version. And sometimes you have to say that, but sometimes it's much easier to show a version of a paragraph or a data table that is specific to the version that you've got. That's where our like custom docs engine really helps us out a lot because we can just do simple markdown text and they handle the presentation layer for us. So something like that, because versions, everything looks great in version 1, but then version 2 comes out and it's a little different. Version 3 comes out and now you've got 3 different things. You're juggling them and your sentences become really weird. So being able to handle stuff like that, especially as it grows, and of course SQL Server has like 17 major versions now under our belt, it gets tricky. And eventually cutting off an unsupported version too. I mean, there's a reason why things go unsupported. It benefits everybody a lot when those things happen.
Do you guys have a big
internally
party
and
when
externally.
you get to drop a SQL Server version?
No, because usually it's a bunch of work. So, you know, I haven't been around for when they kind of cut off things before 2012, but I assume that was really nice. Most of the documentation only applies to 16 and higher. We have ways to get 14 and 12 documentation, but yeah. So I would say that those are 2 pretty big things that you're going to want your docs presentation platform to have to benefit both yourself and just to make a readable sentence sometimes.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, the other thing I mentioned about the companies that want an internal version of the docs inside their own private network that's not connected to the internet. The use of relative links over absolute links is incredibly important in that case, because if you put a link in there to HTTP something, obviously it breaks. But if it's to, you know, .. // subfolder, then it works, even if it's rehoused internally in someone who's just cloned a repo somewhere. That's been a really big focus for us because we have a lot of clients who are doing that these days. So that's a big deal. And even across other things like our dev blogs, our cloud blogs, Channel 9, stuff like that, it needs to be a relative link, not an absolute link.
Makes sense.
Well, cool, guys. Look, I actually got to go. I got a 5 o'clock Pacific time meeting. It's great to talk to y'all. Congratulations on keeping this user group up and running.